Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that sounds a little too heavy for bedtime, and yet, somehow history manages to make it feel strangely distant and quiet. So go ahead, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe pull a blanket a little closer, because we are going to drift through one of those topics that is both unsettling and oddly repetitive. The kind of thing humanity kept doing, again and again, with a sort of tired consistency. Tonight, we're talking about children in ancient armies. Not the heroic, polished versions from movies. Not the neat little legends. Just the real ones. The small, tired, often confused kids who somehow ended up in the middle of very adult wars. Now, before your brain decides to wake up and get serious, don't worry. We're not here for shock or drama. We're here to slowly float through the past, noticing things, connecting dots, and occasionally raising an eyebrow at how strangely casual people used to be about all of this. Because if there's one thing history does very well, it's treating deeply uncomfortable realities as if they were just part of the daily routine, like taxes, or bad weather, or apparently sending your 10-year-old into a battlefield. So let's start gently. Picture an ancient city. Stone walls, dusty streets, the smell of bread and smoke hanging in the air. Somewhere in that city, there's a boy. Maybe 12 years old, maybe younger. He's not particularly special. He's not destined for greatness. He's just there. And at some point, someone, usually an adult who really should know better, decides that this child is now useful. Not in the help him carry groceries sense. No, useful in the here's a spear, try not to drop it sense. And surprisingly, this wasn't rare. It wasn't even unusual. In many ancient societies, the idea of childhood as a protected, gentle phase of life was, let's say, flexible. Very flexible. Children were expected to grow up quickly. And quickly often meant immediately. Because when a city needed defenders, or an army needed more bodies, or a ruler needed to prove a point, children were simply included. Not always willingly. Not always proudly, but included nonetheless. Now let's drift over to ancient Greece for a moment. Because of course we are. Greece has a habit of showing up in every historical conversation, usually looking philosophical and slightly overconfident. In places like Sparta, children didn't just stumble into military life. They were designed for it, carefully, intentionally, almost obsessively. Spartan boys were taken from their families at a very young age and placed into a system that was less school and more long-term survival experiment. They were trained to fight, to endure, to obey, and perhaps most importantly, to not complain about any of it. Which is impressive, because most children today complain about Wi-Fi speed. These boys grew up in barracks, learning discipline the hard way. Hunger, cold, exhaustion. These weren't unfortunate side effects. They were part of the curriculum. And by the time they reached their teenage years, they were already functioning as soldiers. Not fully grown, not fully experienced, but definitely involved. They acted as scouts, messengers, and sometimes even participated directly in combat. Because if you're going to build a society entirely around warfare, you might as well start early. And what happened to them after battles? Well, if they survived, and that's always a very important, if they simply continued. There was no dramatic ceremony where someone said, "Congratulations, you were a child soldier. Now please return to normal life." Because there was no normal life waiting. War was the normal life. They grew into adult soldiers, carrying the same habits, the same training, and often the same emotional distance they had been taught as children. It was less a transition and more a continuation. A very long, very exhausting continuation. Now let's slowly glide eastward, because Greece was not alone in this. Not even close. In ancient Rome, things were slightly different, but only slightly. Roman society liked to present itself as organized and civilized, which it was, in a very structured, paperwork-heavy kind of way. But when it came to warfare, Rome also had a habit of involving the young. Boys from military families were often brought along on campaigns. Not as full soldiers at first, but as assistants, trainees, and observers. Which sounds harmless, until you remember that observing in this context often meant standing near actual battles. These boys learned by watching. They watched formations move. They watched discipline being enforced. And yes, they watched people getting injured and worse, all in that very calm, methodical Roman way. Over time, they were gradually absorbed into the military system. By their mid-teens, many were already participating more directly. And again, what happened afterward was not particularly dramatic. If they survived, they advanced. They became proper soldiers, then veterans. Then, if they were lucky and reasonably competent, they retired with some land and a slightly tired expression. But not all children in ancient armies were part of structured systems like Sparta or Rome. Some were there because they had no choice at all. And this is where things become quietly uncomfortable in a different way. Because across many ancient civilizations, whether in parts of the Near East, Africa, or Asia, children were sometimes taken during conflicts, captured, displaced, and then repurposed. It's a very cold word, repurposed, but it fits. These children might be forced into service as laborers, porters, or assistants. Some were trained as fighters, especially if they showed any sign of physical ability. Others were simply kept around to support the army in less visible ways. Cooking, carrying supplies, maintaining camps. The kind of work that doesn't get mentioned in heroic stories, but without which armies would fall apart in about 3 days. And after battles? Well, their fates varied, but rarely in comforting ways. Some remained attached to the army, growing up within it, gradually becoming part of the system that had absorbed them. Others were sold, traded, or relocated, depending on what was most convenient for whoever was in charge. A few, very few, managed to return to something resembling their original lives. But for most, the idea of going back simply didn't exist anymore. Now let's pause for a moment, not a dramatic pause, just a gentle one, and notice something interesting. In all of these cases, whether in Sparta, Rome, or elsewhere, there is a pattern. Children in armies were not seen as temporary participants. They were investments, long-term ones. Societies didn't expect them to leave the military world behind. They expected them to grow into it, to become part of it so completely that the line between childhood and adulthood just kind of faded away. And occasionally, just to keep things a little strange, some of these young individuals were actually honored. Not in a modern, carefully managed, award ceremony kind of way, but in a more subtle cultural sense. A boy who showed bravery, who followed orders, who didn't run away. These were qualities that earned respect, even if that boy was far too young to fully understand what he was doing. Especially then, actually, because nothing says impressive discipline like a child acting like a very small adult. But honor didn't necessarily mean comfort, or happiness, or even safety. It simply meant recognition. A nod, a story told later, perhaps slightly exaggerated, about how even the youngest among us stood firm. Which sounds inspiring until you think about it for more than 5 seconds. And then there were the ones who were forgotten. Not deliberately, not with any grand decision. Just gradually. After battles ended, after armies moved on, after rulers changed and priorities shifted, many of these children simply disappeared from the historical record. No dramatic endings. No clear conclusions. Just silence. Which, in a way, might be the most common outcome of all. Because history, for all its grand narratives and famous names, has a habit of losing track of the small, the ordinary, and the inconvenient. And child soldiers were often all three at once. So as we slowly drift forward, keep that in mind. Not as a heavy thought, just as a quiet background detail. These children were there. They played roles, small and large. They survived, or they didn't. They were praised or ignored. And then, like so many people in the past, they faded into the long, soft blur of history. And from here, we're going to gently move into another part of this story. Because as it turns out, some societies didn't just use children in war. They built entire traditions around it, which, as you might expect, leads to some very unusual outcomes. And from here, we're going to gently move into another part of this story. Because as it turns out, some societies didn't just use children in war. They built entire traditions around it, which, as you might expect, leads to some very unusual outcomes. Let's slowly drift into ancient Macedonia for a moment. A place of mountains, ambition, and eventually, one very famous overachiever named Alexander. But before anyone starts conquering half the known world, there's a quieter system in place. One that involves young boys being brought into royal courts, not just as decoration, but as future soldiers and companions. These boys were often the sons of nobles, which sounds prestigious, and in a way it was. But it also meant they were expected to grow up quickly. They were trained in riding, hunting, and combat from a young age. Not in a rushed, chaotic way, but in a steady, almost routine manner, like brushing your teeth. Except instead of a toothbrush, you have a spear, and instead of minty freshness, you have, well, mild exhaustion. By the time they were teenagers, many of these boys were already accompanying armies on campaigns. Not always fighting on the front lines, but certainly close enough to understand what war actually looked like. And again, we see that same pattern. If they survived, they didn't leave, they advanced. They became officers, generals, or at the very least, very experienced soldiers with a long list of stories they probably didn't tell in detail. Now let's gently slide over to another region, because this pattern shows up in places you might not immediately expect. In parts of ancient China, especially during the long and rather chaotic periods of constant warfare, young boys were often drawn into military life early. Not always through formal systems like Sparta, but through necessity. When kingdoms are constantly fighting, they tend to run low on manpower. And when that happens, the definition of manpower becomes flexible, very flexible. Boys in their early teens might be trained as archers or assistants. Some were part of militias, defending local areas. Others were absorbed into larger armies, learning as they went, which is a polite way of saying they were figuring things out while everything around them was actively dangerous. And what happened to them after battles? Much like elsewhere, survival meant continuation. A boy who proved capable might be kept, trained further, and gradually turned into a full soldier. In some cases, he might even rise in rank. Not because of any grand merit system, but because in times of constant war, any experience, was valuable, even if it came from someone who had started far too young. But not every child in these systems had a clear path forward. Some were left behind after battles. Not in a dramatic, abandoned on a hilltop way, but in a quieter, more administrative sense. Armies moved on, campaigns shifted, and those who were no longer useful, or who simply didn't fit into the next phase, were left to figure things out. Now let's take a soft turn into ancient Egypt, because Egypt always brings a slightly different flavor to history. More organized, more structured, and occasionally a little bit mysterious just to keep things interesting. In Egypt, the use of children in warfare was less formalized than in places like Sparta, but it still existed. Young boys, especially those connected to military families, might be trained early. They could serve as assistants, messengers, or part of support units. And in times of need, they might be drawn closer to actual combat roles. But Egypt also had something else. A strong emphasis on order and continuity, which meant that some of these young individuals were absorbed into the military bureaucracy over time. If they survived, they might become scribes attached to military units, or administrators, or lower-ranking officers. Not everyone became a frontline soldier forever. Some transitioned into roles that were less physically demanding, but still very much tied to the system that had shaped their early lives. So in a way, Egypt offers a slightly softer outcome. Not gentle exactly, but structured, predictable, A child brought into the military world might remain within it, but not always in the same capacity. There was movement, adaptation, and occasionally, a chance to step away from direct combat. Now let's pause again and notice another pattern forming. Because across all these regions, Macedonia, China, Egypt, we're seeing variations of the same idea. Children enter the system early. They are shaped by it. And then, if they survive, they remain within it in some form. But here's where things take a slightly different turn. Because not all societies treated young soldiers as future assets. Some treated them as temporary solutions. And that distinction matters. Let's drift toward certain nomadic and tribal groups, where warfare was often more fluid, less structured, and deeply tied to survival. In these contexts, children might join raids or defensive efforts simply because everyone was involved. There wasn't always a clear separation between civilian and soldier. Life itself was a bit of both. In such settings, a child might fight alongside adults, not as part of a formal training program, but because there was no alternative. And after the conflict, life would simply continue. There were no ranks to climb, no structured careers to pursue. A child who survived might return to herding, farming, or whatever daily life required. Which, in a strange way, is both simpler and more complicated. Simpler because there's no long-term military system to absorb them. More complicated because there's also no clear support, no transition, no acknowledgement of what they've experienced. It just becomes part of life. Another story, another memory, quietly folded into everything else. And then, of course, there are the cases where children were used in ways that were even more unsettling, though still described in very calm, matter-of-fact historical terms. Some were placed in particularly risky roles, precisely because they were small, quick, and, from a purely strategic standpoint, somewhat expendable. Scouts sent ahead. Messengers running through dangerous territory. The kind of tasks that sound almost adventurous until you remember the stakes involved. And if they didn't return, the army moved on. Because armies, as a general rule, are not known for stopping everything to process their emotions. They have objectives, they have timelines, and they have a tendency to keep going, regardless of who is left behind. Now let's gently circle back to something we touched on earlier. Recognition. Because in some cases, young soldiers were not just absorbed or forgotten. They were remembered. Sometimes even celebrated. A boy who showed exceptional bravery might be mentioned in records. A young messenger who completed a dangerous task might be praised. These moments were often framed as examples of discipline, loyalty, and courage. And they were used to reinforce cultural values. To say, in a very understated way, this is what we admire. But here's the quiet contradiction. These same stories rarely focus on what happened afterward. The moment of bravery is recorded. The outcome is less detailed. Did the boy grow into a respected soldier? Did he survive long enough to see peace? Did he quietly disappear from the records like so many others? We usually don't know. And that uncertainty becomes part of the pattern. Because history, for all its detail, often prefers the moment over the aftermath. The action over the consequence. So as we continue, just let that thought sit in the background. These children were part of something much larger than themselves. They were shaped by systems, traditions, and circumstances they didn't choose. And after the battles, after the dust settled, their paths diverged in ways that are sometimes clear, and often not. And from here, we're going to drift a little further, into stories where the line between honor and tragedy becomes even more blurred. Because in some places, being a child soldier didn't just shape your life. It defined it completely. And from here, we're going to drift a little further, into stories where the line between honor and tragedy becomes even more blurred. Because in some places, being a child soldier didn't just shape your life, it defined it completely. Let's begin, very slowly, in a place where discipline and tradition reached almost artistic levels of precision: feudal Japan. A world of quiet gardens, careful rituals, and just beneath the surface, a constant readiness for conflict. In this setting, boys born into samurai families were not gently introduced to the idea of warfare. They were expected to grow into it. From an early age, they were taught not just how to fight, but how to think about fighting. Loyalty, honor, duty, these weren't abstract concepts. They were daily instructions. A young samurai boy might begin training with wooden swords, practicing movements again and again until they became automatic. He would learn discipline through repetition, patience through stillness, and perhaps most importantly, emotional restraint. Because showing fear or hesitation was not particularly encouraged, which is a polite way of saying it was discouraged entirely. By the time he reached his early teens, he might already be present during real conflicts. Not always in the most dangerous positions, but close enough to understand that this was no longer practice. This was the real thing. And after battle? Well, much like in Sparta, there was no clean separation. No moment where someone gently tapped him on the shoulder and said, "You've done enough, go enjoy a peaceful childhood now." Because that childhood had already been redirected. If he survived, he continued. He grew into a full samurai, carrying with him the habits and expectations formed in those early years. The battlefield wasn't a phase. It was a foundation, and even in times of peace, the mindset remained. Always ready, always prepared, always slightly tense beneath the calm surface. Now let's gently shift westward again, because Japan was not alone in shaping children so completely around warfare. In parts of the ancient Near East, including powerful empires that rose and fell with impressive regularity, children were often brought into military systems through a combination of necessity and opportunity. Some were born into it, much like the samurai. Others were taken in through conquest or tribute systems. And here, we begin to see something that feels oddly structured in its own way. Young boys might be selected, trained, and integrated into elite units over time. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually. They learned discipline, combat skills, and loyalty to the state or ruler. And if they proved capable, they could rise, not just as soldiers, but as trusted members of the system. But again, the key detail remains the same. There was no after in the way we might imagine it. No return to a previous life. The army wasn't something they visited. It was where they lived, grew, and eventually aged, if they were fortunate enough to reach that stage. And then there were the children who didn't belong to structured systems at all. The ones who found themselves in armies through chaos rather than design. Let's picture a battlefield that isn't part of a grand organized campaign. Maybe it's a regional conflict. A sudden clash between groups. The kind of event that disrupts everything without warning. In these situations, children might be pulled in simply because they were there. They carried supplies. They followed older relatives. They tried to help in whatever small ways they could. And sometimes, those small ways became larger, more dangerous roles. Because when things start to fall apart, roles tend to blur. After the battle, if they survived, they didn't receive medals or formal recognition. They simply continued living. Perhaps with a slightly different understanding of the world. A little more quiet. A little more aware. And here's where things become subtly complicated. Because while some of these children were absorbed into military life, others were pushed out of it just as quickly as they had entered. Not because anyone made a thoughtful decision, but because the situation changed. The conflict ended. The army disbanded. The immediate need disappeared. And suddenly, a child who had been part of something intense and overwhelming was expected to return to ordinary life. Except ordinary didn't quite fit anymore. Not perfectly. Not smoothly. But ancient societies didn't spend much time analyzing that kind of transition. There were no discussions about adjustment or recovery. Life simply moved forward. And individuals were expected to move with it. Now let's gently return to the idea of recognition, because this is where things take another interesting turn. In some cultures, young warriors who proved themselves were given a kind of quiet respect. Not necessarily grand honors, but acknowledgement. A sense that they had contributed. And that acknowledgement could shape their future. A boy who had shown bravery might find doors opening for him within the military or political system. He might gain status, connections, or opportunities that wouldn't have been available otherwise. But and this isn't important, but that recognition was often tied to continued service. It wasn't a reward that allowed him to step away. It was more like an invitation to go deeper, to commit more fully. Which brings us to a slightly ironic observation. For many child soldiers, doing well didn't lead to freedom. It led to more responsibility, more expectations, more involvement in the same system that had shaped them in the first place. And then there were those who didn't perform as expected. The ones who struggled, who hesitated, who simply didn't fit into the role they had been given. Their outcomes were rarely recorded in detail. But we can make some quiet assumptions. They might have been reassigned to less demanding roles, or gradually pushed to the margins of the system, or simply overlooked. Not in a dramatic, intentional way. Just quietly. The way history tends to handle people who don't fit neatly into its narratives. Now let's slow things down even further and look at one final pattern in this section. Memory. Because while some young soldiers were remembered in stories, songs, or records, many were not. And over time, their experiences became part of a larger, more general narrative about war. A narrative that often focuses on leaders, battles, and outcomes, rather than the individuals who made up the majority of the army. So what happened to these children after the battles? The honest answer is, many different things. Some stayed and became lifelong soldiers. Some transitioned into other roles within the same system. Some returned to civilian life, carrying quiet memories with them. And many simply disappeared from the record altogether. Not because their lives were unimportant, but because history has a habit of simplifying itself, of focusing on the broad strokes and letting the smaller details fade into the background. And as we continue, we're going to gently explore what those faded details might have looked like. Because behind every large, sweeping historical event, there are countless individual stories, soft, quiet, and often overlooked. And sometimes, if we listen closely enough, we can almost hear them. And sometimes, if we listen closely enough, we can almost hear them, not clearly. Not like a loud story with a beginning, middle, and satisfying conclusion. More like fragments, small echoes, the kind of details that were never important enough to be written down, but were real all the same. So let's slow things down even further now. Because if there's one question that quietly lingers over everything we've talked about, it's this. What actually happened to these children? When everything was over, not during the battle, not in the moment of bravery, but afterward, when the dust settled, when the army moved on, when the noise faded. And the answer, as you've probably guessed by now, is not neat. It's not organized. It doesn't come with a clear list or a tidy conclusion. It's scattered. Some of them stayed exactly where they were. They didn't leave the army, because the army had become their entire world. There was no outside life waiting for them. No village they could return to, no childhood they could resume. So they continued. Year after year, campaign after campaign, gradually becoming the adults who would one day train the next group of children. It's a very quiet cycle, almost invisible if you don't look directly at it. One generation shaping the next, not out of cruelty exactly, but out of habit, out of expectation. Because this is simply how things are done. And if you imagine one of those boys, now older, maybe in his 20s or 30s, teaching a younger child how to hold a weapon, there's something oddly calm about it. Not kind, not cruel, just practiced. Like someone showing you how to tie a knot, or how to bake bread. Except the skill being passed on is survival in a very specific, very unforgiving environment. Now some of them didn't stay. And this is where things become a little more uncertain. Because leaving the army, whether by choice or by circumstance, didn't necessarily mean stepping into a comfortable life. Imagine growing up entirely within a military structure, every day defined by orders, routines, expectations. And then suddenly, that structure is gone. The army disbands. The war ends. Or perhaps you're simply no longer needed. What do you do next? Ancient societies didn't exactly provide guidance for that kind of situation. There were no gentle transitions, no quiet support systems waiting to help someone adjust. You were expected to figure it out. Some likely returned to civilian life, blending back into villages or towns as best they could. They might take up farming, trade, or whatever work was available. And on the surface, they might look like anyone else. Just another person going about daily routines. But underneath, there would be differences. Small ones, subtle ones, the way they reacted to sudden noise. The way they watched people, the habits they carried without thinking. Not in a dramatic or exaggerated way. Just quietly. And then there were those who didn't quite manage that transition. Who found it difficult to fit into a slower, more ordinary rhythm of life. Not because they were incapable, but because they had been shaped for something else entirely. These individuals might drift, from place to place, from job to job. Or they might stay on the edges of communities, never fully settling into one role. Again, history doesn't give us detailed records of these lives. It rarely does. But if we follow the patterns we've already seen, it's not hard to imagine. Now let's gently turn toward another outcome. One that is less often talked about, but just as important. Some of these children didn't survive long enough to face any kind of after, not in a dramatic storytelling sense. There were no grand final moments, no carefully recorded last words. Just the quiet, matter-of-fact reality of ancient warfare. It was dangerous, unpredictable, and often unforgiving. And when a child didn't return from a task, or a battle, or a journey, the army continued. Because that's what armies do. They move forward. They adapt. They replace what they've lost. It's not a comforting thought, but it is a consistent one. Across civilizations, across centuries, the pattern remains the same. Now let's return, just briefly, to the idea of honor, because this is where things become a little ironic. Some of these young soldiers were remembered, as we mentioned before. Their actions were noted, their bravery acknowledged, their names occasionally recorded. But that honor didn't necessarily change their outcome. It didn't guarantee safety. It didn't provide a different path. It simply existed. A small recognition within a much larger system. And sometimes, that recognition faded over time. Stories were simplified, names were forgotten, details were lost. Until all that remained was a general idea. A vague memory that even the young fought bravely. Which, when you think about it, is both true and incomplete. Because it captures the action, but not the aftermath. The moment, but not the life that followed. And that brings us to perhaps the quietest ending of all. Being forgotten. Not erased. Not deliberately removed. Just not recorded. Not mentioned again. Most people in history fall into this category, of course. But for child soldiers, it feels particularly noticeable. Because their experiences were so intense, so defining, and yet so rarely followed to their conclusion. They appear briefly in the narrative. A young helper, a messenger, a brave boy in a difficult moment. And then, they're gone. The story moves on to generals, kings, and outcomes. And the child becomes part of the background. So what happened to them? Some lived long lives within the systems that shaped them. Some stepped away and built quieter, less visible futures. Some struggled, some adapted. Some were remembered in small and fleeting ways, and many were simply absorbed into the vast, quiet silence of history. And as we slowly come to the end of this long drifting journey, there's no single conclusion to hold on to. No clear lesson neatly tied together. Just a pattern. A very human one. Societies doing what they believed was necessary. Children adapting as best they could. And history, as always, remembering some things and letting others fade. So tonight, as everything settles and quiets down, you can let that thought gently drift away. Not something to hold on to too tightly, just a small, distant understanding that even in the largest wars, the loudest victories, and the grandest stories, there were always smaller lives moving quietly within them. We can begin, very gently, inside a palace that looks calm from the outside. All polished stone and orderly gardens, but inside it is a place of quiet adjustments, soft footsteps, and people speaking in careful tones, because the king is not quite himself, and everyone knows it, but no one says it out loud. Because calling your ruler mad is a dangerous hobby, and historically, it tends to shorten your life quite a bit. So instead people used softer language like unwell, or melancholic, or the classic royal favorite, touched by God, which is a very polite way of saying something has gone deeply, unmistakably wrong. And what is interesting is that these rulers were not usually thrown into dark dungeons or chained to walls like in dramatic movies, because, inconveniently, they were still the king. And you cannot exactly lock up the person whose signature makes your entire political system function. So instead, what you get is a strange middle ground where everyone pretends things are fine while quietly reorganizing reality around one unstable human being. Take a moment to imagine waking up in a palace where your day is already planned for you, not in the normal royal way, but in a very controlled, very curated manner where every servant, advisor, and family member has been instructed on how to handle you, what topics to avoid, what moods to accommodate, and what behaviors to gently ignore. And this is the daily life of many so-called mad rulers. Not chaos, not screaming halls, but an eerie kind of structured denial. Because the goal was not to cure them, not really, since medieval and early modern medicine was not exactly thriving in the mental health department, but rather to manage them, to keep them functional enough, or at least harmless enough, so the machinery of power could keep moving without too much interruption, and this often meant isolation. But a very luxurious kind of isolation, the sort where you are surrounded by tapestries and gold plates, but your world is slowly shrinking without you quite realizing it. And sometimes, the ruler themselves did not fully understand what was happening, because the process was subtle, almost gentle, like being wrapped in layers of soft fabric until you can no longer move freely, and everyone smiles at you while doing it, which is in its own quiet way much more unsettling than open conflict. Because imagine being a king who starts having episodes, maybe paranoia, maybe sudden bursts of anger, maybe long stretches of silence where nothing quite connects, and at first, people around you try to accommodate, they nod along, they agree with things that make very little sense. Because correcting a king is already risky, correcting an unstable king is almost suicidal. So instead they adjust, they adapt, they create a version of reality that keeps him calm. And this is where things become strangely theatrical, because entire courts would begin to act in ways that reinforced the ruler as delusions, or avoided triggering them, like a very elaborate, slow-moving play where everyone knows the script except the main character. If the king believed he was made of glass, which yes did actually happen, then the solution was not to argue with him about basic physics, but to pad his surroundings, to move carefully, to treat him as if he might shatter, because in a sense the political stability of the kingdom might shatter if he became too distressed. And this brings us to a slightly uncomfortable realization, which is that these rulers were often enabled rather than restrained. Not out of kindness necessarily, but out of necessity, because confronting them could lead to worse outcomes, and replacing them was rarely simple, since royal succession is a delicate and often explosive matter. So instead of removing a mad ruler, courts would build systems around them, layers of advisors who would quietly take over decision-making documents that would be presented for signature at carefully chosen moments, and schedules designed to minimize stress or unpredictability, and over time the ruler becomes less of an active leader and more of a ceremonial presence, even if no one openly admits it. And this is where the isolation deepens, because while they are still technically in power, their real influence begins to fade, not through dramatic coups, but through a slow erosion of agency. where fewer and fewer real decisions reach them, and more of their life is controlled by others. But it is not always gentle, because sometimes the behavior becomes too erratic, too visible, too impossible to smooth over. And at that point, the strategies become more direct, though still wrapped in the language of care and protection. Because no one wants to say, "We are imprisoning the king." So instead they say things like, "The king needs rest," or "The king will remain in his private apartments for his health." And those private apartments can become, very quietly, a kind of gilded cage, with locked doors, controlled access, and a very limited set of people allowed in, often those who are loyal, discreet, and willing to play along with whatever version of reality is currently being maintained. And from the outside, everything still looks stable, because the court continues, ceremonies happen, documents are issued, and the illusion of continuity is preserved, which is incredibly important in monarchies, because stability is, in many ways, more valuable than truth. Now, what makes this even more complicated is that not all madness was treated the same way, because it depended heavily on how the behavior affected governance, and this is where the line between tolerated eccentricity and dangerous instability becomes very blurry. Because a ruler who was odd withdrawn or deeply melancholic might still be considered manageable, even acceptable, as long as they did not disrupt the core functions of power. But a ruler who became unpredictable, aggressive, or delusional in ways that interfered with decision-making was a much bigger problem. And even then the response was rarely immediate removal, because removing a monarch could trigger political crises, rebellions, or power struggles, so courts often delayed action for as long as possible, hoping things would stabilize or at least become predictable in their unpredictability. And this creates a strange dynamic where the ruler is both protected and controlled, respected and quietly sidelined, surrounded by people who are constantly balancing loyalty with practicality, because their own survival often depends on managing the situation carefully. And if we slow down and sit in this moment for a bit, it becomes clear that the daily life of these rulers was not dramatic in the way we might expect, but rather slow, repetitive, and heavily managed, with routines designed to keep them calm, interactions carefully curated, and any signs of instability gently redirected or ignored. They might spend long hours in private chambers, attended by a small group of trusted servants, engaging in simple activities, walking in controlled gardens, or participating in limited court functions where everything has been arranged to minimize risk. And over time, their world becomes smaller, quieter, and more controlled, not through force alone, but through a combination of habit, expectation, and subtle restriction, until the vast power they once held exists mostly in name. And perhaps the most unsettling part is that many of them lived like this for years, even decades, in a kind of suspended state where they were still the ruler, but not quite, still surrounded by luxury, but deeply isolated, still respected in title, but managed in practice. And the people around them, the advisors, the family members, the servants, they all become part of this system, whether willingly or not, because maintaining the illusion of a functioning monarchy is often seen as more important than confronting the reality of a broken one. So the palace becomes a place of quiet adjustments, soft corrections, and carefully maintained appearances, where madness is not loudly acknowledged but gently absorbed into the daily routine, like a crack in a wall that is painted over again and again until it almost disappears, at least from a distance. And from that distance, everything looks perfectly fine, which, as history shows us, is often the goal, because as long as the kingdom believes the ruler is in control, then in a strange and fragile way, he still is. And if we gently continue from that quiet, controlled palace atmosphere, we eventually find ourselves in the court of Charles VI of France, where the system of soft management is no longer subtle in the way it used to be, but also not quite open enough to be called honest, which is exactly the uncomfortable middle ground medieval courts seem to specialize in. Because Charles did not begin his life as a cautionary tale, of course he did not, that would be far too convenient. Instead he began as a perfectly promising young king, energetic, well-liked, and by all early accounts quite capable, which makes everything that follows feel a little more unsettling, because it is not a story of someone always being unstable, but of someone gradually slipping while an entire kingdom tries to keep up appearances. And at first, the changes are small, the kind you could almost ignore if you tried hard enough. A bit of irritability, moments of confusion, the occasional odd decision, and people around him likely brushed it off with the usual courtly optimism, because acknowledging a problem early would require doing something about it. And doing something about it would open a whole series of very dangerous political questions. So naturally, they did what most courts did best, which is nothing, but in a very organized and elegant way. But then things escalate slowly at first, and then not so slowly until you reach moments that are difficult to ignore, even by the standards of a medieval court that has seen quite a lot already. And one of the most famous of these moments is when Charles suddenly becomes convinced that he is made of glass. Now this is one of those details that sounds almost too strange to be real, but it is very well documented, and more importantly, it tells us exactly how his court chose to respond, because no one sat him down and said, "Your Majesty, you are not a fragile glass ornament." That would be logical, and logic is not always the priority in a royal court dealing with instability. Instead, they adapted. They patted his clothing, they ensured that he was handled carefully, they adjusted his environment so that nothing would break him, and in doing so they effectively validated his belief, not because they agreed with it, but because contradicting it might trigger something worse. And this is where the line between care and enabling becomes very thin, because from the outside, it looks compassionate. They are protecting their king, making him comfortable, but at the same time, they are reinforcing a delusion that further separates him from reality. And this was not a one-time incident, not a brief episode that passed quietly, but part of a larger pattern of behavior that became increasingly difficult to manage, because Charles would have periods of relative clarity, where he seemed almost himself again, followed by episodes of deep instability, where he could not recognize people close to him, including, at times, his own wife. Now imagine being in that court, living through this cycle, never quite sure which version of the king you are going to encounter on any given day, and having to adjust your behavior accordingly, because one wrong word, one familiar gesture at the wrong moment could cause confusion or distress. So people learn to read him very carefully, to watch for signs, to adapt their tone, their language, even their presence depending on his state, which turns the entire court into a kind of emotional balancing act. And in the middle of all this, governance still has to happen. Wars do not pause, taxes still need to be collected, alliances maintained, and this is where the management system becomes more visible, because decisions cannot rely on a ruler who is unpredictable. So power begins to shift, not officially, not in a way that is declared to the public, but practically quietly into the hands of advisors, relatives and factions within the court, each of them claiming to act in the king's best interest, which, as you might guess, often overlaps very conveniently with their own interests. And this creates a second layer of instability, because now you do not just have a king who is unwell, you have multiple groups competing to control access to him, to influence decisions, to present documents at the right moment, or to keep certain information away from him entirely. And the king himself, during his clearer moments, may have been aware, at least partially, that things were slipping out of his control, which adds a quiet layer of tragedy to the whole situation, because it is one thing to lose control, it is another to sense it happening and be unable to stop it. But the court cannot afford to dwell on that, because the primary goal remains stability, or at least the appearance of stability. So ceremonies continue, proclamations are issued in his name, and the machinery of monarchy keeps moving, even if the person at the center of it is no longer fully steering it. And when his behavior becomes too erratic, too visible to ignore, the solution is, once again, a form of controlled isolation, though always framed in the language of care, because no one wants to admit that the king is effectively being sidelined. So Charles spends increasing amounts of time in more private settings, surrounded by a smaller, carefully selected group of attendants, people who are used to his condition, who know how to manage his episodes, who can keep things calm and predictable. And from the outside, this can be presented as rest, recovery, a necessary retreat for health, which sounds reasonable enough, especially in a time when medical understanding is limited and rest is often the default prescription for almost everything. But in practice, it means reduced access, fewer public appearances, and a growing distance between the king and the wider world he is supposed to rule. And yet, interestingly, he is never fully removed, never officially declared unfit in a way that would strip him of his title, because doing so would open a very dangerous political door, one that could lead to disputes over succession, legitimacy, and power. So instead, he remains king in name, in ceremony, in official documents, while the reality of governance is handled increasingly by others, and everyone participates in this quiet agreement, not to state the obvious too clearly. And if we slow down again and sit with this, it becomes clear that Charles's daily life, especially in his later years, is not defined by dramatic outbursts alone, but by long stretches of controlled routine punctuated by episodes that everyone around him is trained to handle. He would be guided through his day, his interactions managed, his environment adjusted, and his access to the outside world carefully filtered, creating a life that is at once royal and deeply restricted. And the people around him, from high-ranking nobles to lowly servants, all become part of this system, each playing their role in maintaining the illusion that the king is still, in some meaningful way, in control. Because that illusion is not just comforting. It is politically necessary, and without it, the entire structure of authority could begin to crack. So what we see in the case of Charles VI of France is not a story of a ruler being dramatically cast aside, but of a ruler being slowly, carefully managed, protected, and in many ways contained, all while still wearing the crown. And it is a pattern we will see again, with different variations, different personalities, and different outcomes, but always with that same underlying goal, to keep the system functioning, even if the person at the center of it is no longer fully able to do so. And from here, we can gently drift toward another court, another ruler, and another version of this quiet, careful management, because history, as it turns out, has quite a few of these stories, and they all unfold with that same slow, almost sleepy rhythm of denial, adaptation, and control. And if we continue drifting from one carefully managed court to another, we eventually arrive in the world of Joanna of Castile, which at first glance looks like another story about instability, but very quickly starts to feel more like a story about control, power, and a very long, very quiet kind of imprisonment that no one officially calls imprisonment. Because Joanna's situation is slightly different, in a way that makes it even more uncomfortable, since unlike some rulers who gradually lost control due to illness, her madness is something that has been debated for centuries, which is always a sign that something more complicated is going on behind the scenes. And from the beginning, her life is shaped by forces that have very little to do with her own choices, which, to be fair, is not unusual for a royal woman of her time. But in Joanna's case, it becomes particularly intense, because she is not just a princess, she is a political asset, a piece in a much larger dynastic game that is being played by people who are very good at pretending it is all perfectly normal. She is the daughter of powerful monarchs, raised in a court where expectations are high and personal freedom is optional at best, and like many royal daughters, her future is decided early. Arranged marriage, strategic alliance, the usual routine, nothing especially surprising there. But what becomes important is how her behavior is later interpreted, because Joanna is described as deeply emotional, intensely attached, sometimes jealous, sometimes withdrawn, and while that might sound dramatic, it is also, if we are being honest, not entirely outside the range of normal human behavior, especially for someone living under constant pressure and limited autonomy. And yet, over time, these traits begin to be reframed, reinterpreted, and slowly labeled as something more serious, something that can be used, intentionally or not, to justify limiting her power. Because here is where things take a turn. Joanna is not just a queen in title. She is, at certain points, the legitimate ruler of Castile, which makes her position incredibly important, and also incredibly inconvenient for those who might prefer to rule in her place. So when questions arise about her stability, those questions do not exist in a vacuum. They are deeply connected to political interests, to who benefits from her being seen as incapable, and who gains control if she is removed from active governance. And what follows is not a dramatic overthrow, not a sudden declaration of madness and immediate imprisonment, but a slow process, a gradual tightening of control that feels almost administrative in its calmness. At first, it is supervision, guidance, people around her making decisions for her benefit, which sounds reasonable enough, especially if there are genuine concerns about her well-being. But over time, that supervision becomes restriction. Her movements are limited, her interactions controlled, her ability to exercise power quietly reduced, and all of it is framed in the language of care, protection, and necessity, which makes it very difficult to openly challenge. Because how do you argue against someone who says they are protecting the queen from herself, especially in a time when mental health is poorly understood and easily politicized? And so Joanna's world begins to shrink, not in a sudden, dramatic way, but in small, almost imperceptible steps, until she is no longer actively ruling, even though she still holds the title. And eventually, this process leads to her long confinement, where she is kept in a controlled environment for years, then decades, which is where the story becomes less about management and more about endurance. Because unlike some rulers who had periods of freedom or influence, Joanna spends a significant portion of her life in isolation, and not the luxurious, socially active kind of isolation we sometimes see in royal settings, but a much quieter, more restricted existence. Her daily life becomes repetitive, structured, and heavily monitored, with a limited circle of attendants, controlled communication, and very little connection to the outside world, which, if you think about it, is less about treating an illness and more about maintaining a political arrangement. And the most striking part is how normal this becomes within the system, how her confinement is accepted, justified, and integrated into the broader functioning of the monarchy, as if it is simply another detail to be managed. Because the kingdom continues, rulers come and go, decisions are made, and Joanna remains officially the queen, but practically removed from power, her existence reduced to a quiet presence behind walls that are not described as prison walls, but function very much like them. And here, the question of whether she was truly mad becomes almost secondary, because regardless of her mental state, the outcome is the same. She is controlled, isolated, and used as a figurehead when convenient, which tells us a great deal about how such situations were handled. Because unlike Charles VI, whose instability had to be carefully managed in real time, Joanna's case shows us what happens when a ruler is effectively sidelined for the long term, when the system decides that containment is easier than constant adaptation. And the people around her, her family, her advisors, her attendants, all play a role in maintaining this arrangement, whether out of loyalty, self-interest, or simple acceptance of the status quo. Because challenging it would require confronting not just her condition, but the entire structure that benefits from it. And so her life becomes a kind of quiet loop, days blending into each other, interactions limited, decisions made elsewhere, and her presence reduced to something symbolic rather than active. And if we sit with that image for a moment, it is not dramatic, not loud, not chaotic, but very still, which, in its own way, makes it more unsettling, because it shows how easily a person, even a queen, can be gradually removed from power without ever being formally stripped of it. And this is another version of how mad rulers were treated, not always through visible control or theatrical management, but sometimes through long-term confinement that is carefully justified and quietly maintained. And from here, we can gently move onward, because this pattern, this balance between care, control, and convenience, appears again and again, each time shaped by the personalities involved and the political needs of the moment. And as we drift to the next story, it becomes clear that behind palace walls, madness was rarely just a medical issue, it was a political one. handled not with clear solutions, but with slow, careful adjustments that often said more about the court than the ruler themselves. And if we continue from that very still, very controlled existence, we arrive in the later world of George III, where the approach to a mad ruler becomes, in some ways, more structured, more medical, and yet still deeply familiar in its quiet goal of maintaining control without openly breaking the illusion of monarchy. Because by the time we reach George III, we are no longer in the medieval world of vague diagnoses and whispered explanations, but in a period that likes to think of itself as more enlightened, more rational, more organized, which of course does not necessarily mean kinder. It just means the control comes with better paperwork. And George, much like the others, does not begin as a cautionary tale. He begins as a functioning, even diligent ruler. Someone who takes his duties seriously, who involves himself in governance, who, in many ways, fits the ideal of a responsible monarch, which makes his later struggles feel less like a continuation and more like a disruption, a shift that the system is not entirely prepared for, even if it tries very hard to appear as though it is. And when his episodes begin, they are, at first, confusing, difficult to categorize. Periods of agitation, rapid speech, erratic behavior, followed by stretches of exhaustion or withdrawal, and the people around him respond in the way they have learned to respond over centuries. They observe, they adapt, and they try, above all, to keep things from spiraling into visible chaos. But here is where things start to feel slightly different, because now there is a growing interest in medical explanations, in treatments, in the idea that this is something that can be studied and perhaps even managed in a more systematic way. Which sounds promising until you look a little closer at what those treatments actually involve. Because the physicians of the time, while well-meaning in some cases, operate with a very limited understanding, and their methods can be firm, let's say, involving restraints, strict routines, controlled diets, and a general emphasis on discipline, as if the mind could be guided back into place through structure alone. And so George's daily life begins to shift, not just through political management, but through medical management, where his schedule is carefully regulated, his behavior monitored, and his interactions controlled under the supervision of doctors who are as much authority figures as his political advisors. And this creates an interesting overlap where medicine and governance start to blend, because controlling the king's health becomes inseparable from controlling the stability of the people responsible for his care are, in effect, also responsible for maintaining the monarchy itself. And when his condition worsens, the response becomes more direct, more visible, though still wrapped in the language of care, because once again, no one wants to openly declare that the king is no longer capable. So instead, we see the introduction of what is essentially a managed environment, where George is kept under close supervision, his movements limited, his behavior corrected when necessary, and yes, at times, physically restrained when his actions become too unpredictable. And this is where the tone shifts slightly from the earlier cases, because while Charles VI was accommodated and Joanna was confined, George is, in a sense, treated, though that treatment often looks very much like control. His days are structured down to small details: when he wakes, when he eats, when he walks, when he speaks, and even how he speaks. Because excessive talking or agitation is something to be managed, reduced, guided back into calmer patterns. And the people around him, the doctors, the attendants, the advisors, all become part of this system, each with their role, each contributing to the careful balance between maintaining his dignity as a king and limiting his ability to disrupt the system. And outside of this controlled environment, the machinery of government continues, because it has to. And this is where we see the more formal solution begin to take shape, the idea of a regency. Now, unlike the earlier cases where power simply drifted away informally, here it becomes more structured, more official, because the situation has reached a point where the illusion alone is no longer enough. So authority begins to shift to others, most notably his son, who can act in his place, allowing the state to function without requiring the king himself to be consistently capable. And this is in many ways the system finally acknowledging what it has long tried to avoid saying outright, that the ruler is not able to fulfill his role, and that a substitute, however temporary, is necessary. But even then, George is not removed, not erased. He remains the king, his title intact, his presence still symbolically important, even as his actual role diminishes. And his later years become increasingly quiet, more confined, more isolated, as his condition deteriorates, and the focus shifts from management to containment, from trying to guide him back to stability, to simply keeping him safe, and importantly, keeping the system stable around him. And if we pause here, at the end of this progression, it becomes clear that what we have seen across these different rulers is not a single method, but a pattern, a slow evolution of strategies that all aim at the same goal. Because whether it is the gentle accommodation of Charles VI of France, the long-term confinement of Joanna of Castile, or the structured medical control of George III, the underlying approach remains remarkably consistent. Do not break the illusion. Do not destabilize the system. Adjust everything else instead. And so behind palace walls, madness is rarely confronted directly. It is absorbed, redirected, managed, and when necessary, quietly contained, all while the outward image of power remains as intact as possible. And in that sense, these rulers lived in a world that was carefully shaped around them, a world that bent just enough to accommodate their condition, while never quite admitting how much it had to bend in the first place. And that is where this part gently comes to rest, in that quiet, controlled space, where the crown remains firmly in place, even if the person wearing it has, in many ways, already been set aside.